Okay, this is part two of the activity 323 generative design video playlist, and what we're taking a look at right now. In our last video, we finished off with generating our different solutions for our chair model so that I created, and we were able to have a few hours to let this process. Now, purposely in the first video, I did go through and look at, so we can take a look at some of the outcome filters, what study was done, and then we were only doing an additive manufacturing process and with one type of material, just to try to minimize the amount of time. Some of these studies can take many hours, and this one here did take a few hours to generate some ideas for this chair design. So what you can see here are three outcomes. The first outcome, we can kind of take a look. It will load you into a design preview window, and you can kind of see, what iteration that it came up with for our design for this chair. And for some of that, you can spin this around with the view cube. You can use the pan tool, any of the navigation tools as you go along. And you can see here's camera interactions like fit to view, roll, or anything like that. You can always use it's kind of like a constrained orbit kind of tool. And that's kind of how that can be used. Okay, so you can zoom and pan and everything. It's really made for, I think, iPads and things like that to be able to view this, not necessarily to generate the studies, but I think to do a lot of viewing if you have touchscreen kind of capabilities. But down here at the bottom, you'll notice that it'll provide, this is 49 iterations that were done. So if I roll this all the way back to the first iteration, this was the very first iteration that it came up with. And then from there, it continued to evolve. So now let's go to iteration 10. You can kind of see where it starts to remove some material. We'll go by each major one. Here's 20 and 30, and there's 40. And you start to see it kind of take shape, and it got up to 49. So before it kind of determined, that it could only go so far within the set criteria that we had in that case. So the thing you can see is you can always show the preserved geometry. So there's what it preserved, and there was the obstacle geometry that it stayed away from. So you can kind of see how it built the chair around the obstacle geometry and preserved what geometry that we kept in it from the very beginning of the study. So what you can do here is when you're done looking at, you can say finish outcome view. It'll bring you back to this. The other thing is here's some objective ranges. For example, with volume, you can go through and you can drag the slider if you want. You'll notice that as I drug the slider, that one chair went away, and let's see if it'll pop back up. Looks like it won't until we get to the very end. Is that, this goes through, this is kind of the range of values, the minimum amount of volume that the final iteration of the chair of the outcomes we have, 208.34 cubic inches, and then the maximum, which must be this generative outcome number 2, was at 360. So if we want to maintain a certain volume, we can go through and say, well, we want to make sure that we are under 300 cubic inches, and in that case, only 2 of the outcomes, outcome 1 and outcome 3, are going to go through and work out for us in this particular case. So little things here, mass as well, if you want to go through and take a look at, what are ones that, if you're trying to minimize the amount of mass, which is one of the objectives, but also factor of safety, and then also dealing with some of the others. But I'll go ahead and put that slider back up there to kind of look at that. Another way you can compare these is up here in the Explore. You got the properties menus, so they'll show you the thumbnail, and then they will give you all the properties. Another good way is to use the Scatterplot view and utilizing the various, so here this refers to on the y-axis, we have the minimum factor of safety. We could choose, let's say, volume, and we can look at a relationship between the volume. This is a mathematical modeling kind of approach where we take a look at, looking at the volume as compared to how much mass that there is. So you can look and see how big that the chair is versus, and then how much it weighs. So you'll see there's one here. As you look at these different ones, outcome 1 has the least amount of volume and the lowest mass that is available. and then you see outcome 3 when we select it has a little bit higher one. They're very comparative, they're very similar. So as you look at that, and then outcome 2 is really really high, not only in volume but also in the mass. So there's definitely a relationship between when you have a higher volume for a part, there's a higher mass. So we're seeing that here, and we're able to kind of compare and see what those look like. And depending upon what objectives that we have going on, we can also compare based on materials or manufacturing methods, visual similarities, or processing and things like that. So you can see, and here's where some of those can be done. So if we wanted to also look at taking a look at the minimum factor of safety in relationship to the volume. So the volume group outcome number 2 is very high in volume, not very high in its factor of safety. So whereas here we look at generative outcome number 1, very high in safety, very low in volume. So it looks like outcome 1 is actually that's been generated. If depending upon your objectives, if you're going for a high factor of safety, but then also a low volume, looks like to me outcome 1 would be our winner as you take a look. And you can see outcome 3 does not have a very high factor of safety, but it does have a low volume. So you can kind of look at this to see what is your relationships between those desired objectives that you have. And then the last set here is table view, which is just looking at these different outcomes like this. So a lot of times, you're looking at properties. Scatterplot's really great, as well as the thumbnail view, so to be able to do that. But let's say, so here we've made a decision. We've said, okay, outcome 1 is probably our best solution. So based upon the criteria and the objectives we outlined, so here's what it looks like. Even then you can kind of tell, even kind of looking at it. So it has definitely got a lot more, of a design to it than what some of the other outcomes did. And so what you can do here is you can take a look at, one, you can see there's as we noticed before, the preserved geometry and the objective geometry, the obstacle geometry, I should say. And what we can do is, if we like this, we can say create a design from outcome, and it'll ask for show cloud costs and balances. So since if you're in an education account, you'll have an unlimited amount of credit accounts, so you can go ahead and say create design, and that will go through and generate a model within, and you'll have a status bar here that we'll be able to create and be able to utilize to 3D print, to kind of analyze in the regular design workspace. So it'll create that for us. But again, so as we take a look, you'll see that progress bar, and when it's done, you'll be able to go through and see that. So it's preparing the design. It may take a little time to process that, and in the meantime, you can always working on some other files and things like that. So this is just a really neat tool, really neat feature within Fusion 360 that allows you to generate a lot of outcomes by really providing a small amount of input and being able to see what kind of iterations that can happen. So this is going to finish up our video series on generative design and for activity 323, and this will allow us to go through and generate some really cool designs, really cool parts, without having to go through and draw and create a bunch of different geometry in order to make that happen.